Always good to be back on this podcast and share a wealth of knowledge with my expert analyst, my usual guest, Chrispin Daka. Just to recap, last week we talked about the customer banker relationship, and we did discuss a number of aspects of that relationship, and of course did delve into the fact that sometimes it's important for the client to make the first move and make sure that they are close to the bank. We continue with our discussion on bankability, and today we talk about a very interesting, aspect, and that is the aspect of risk. And obviously, to help me delve into the details of this discussion, I've got my usual, uh, you know, guest and my usual analyst, Crispin Daka. Sidi, always good to have you on this podcast.
Always a great pleasure. Always a great pleasure. I always look forward to these conversations. Yeah, where we share some nuggets on, like you've mentioned, on this journey, and we cannot overemphasize this enough. It's pretty much trying to say, look, if you are going to scale, you actually need to leverage debt, but you need to do it in a very, very, very smart way, which is very, very possible. And we want to continue because we want Zambian businesses to scale, but just without any access to capital, especially in the form of debt. You know that debt is the most widely available kind of capital. Without debt, then we know that the dream of building significant businesses, growing businesses in Zambia is going to remain always a pipe dream, because including everybody else, including the foreigners that are coming here, they're coming here, setting up, but when you look through their structure, yes, they are bringing some of the equity with them, including some of the assets, but at the end of the day, the bigger component is always the issue of debt. They've got access, and they're able to access the debt market, as it were. And the issue of risk, so we just so that everything is in context. So we talked of, is debt good or bad? I think we've made a case for saying, look, it's how you treat it. Just like with any good thing, any tool, if used in a wrong way, it can actually hit you. So, and we've talked about the preparedness and what needs to follow on. And now where we are, including the issue of a relationship and how to even manage your own bank account. We talked about the credit history and how that can be a very significant asset for you for growth in terms of leveraging debt. And today we're talking about risk. Now, for me, sometimes, like especially as a growing business, the issue of risk sounds too far-fetched because it sounds too academic.
Correct, yeah.
But it's one of the key ingredients that the bank actually looks at in terms of what kind of risks are you, what kind of risks do you have, which are usually, they are very, very unique to you. They are usually very, very unique to the way you do business and the kind of business you are in, and where you stand. And then they analyze that and see whether or not you are a good bet. Because for them, it's an issue of probability. Based on this, is this person a good bet to make sure that they're able to meet their obligations when they fall due? And should they default, are we able to recover our money somewhere? So those are the things I thought we bring them to a very practical level today, and discuss, practical, first of all, what risks we see. And being a growing business ourselves, and we can also share, like how we've been able to. So what we're talking about here is not academic. These are things that we've been able to implement, we've seen in our own business, and we have now implemented, and we continue to manage that risk profile, as it were. Yeah.
Excellent.
So very important topic, very, very important book, which should never be ignored by the entrepreneur.
Or taken for granted. And
Oh yes, taken for granted indeed.
exactly, as
Oh,
as
taken
people
for
refer,
granted.
exactly, as people refer to this podcast, they are now beginning to call it the Forbes podcast, which is very interesting. Now let's get into the crux of the matter, CD. And in the practical sense, when we talk about risk, just define in practical sense, what is risk when it comes to bankability? What are the key elements of risk?
Yeah. So for me, I'll bring it down much more. Instead of going into the definitions of,
Yeah.
I would really
What are the
just go
elements? Yeah. Examples. Yeah.
into how it manifests in business.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So one of the buckets of risks that as a business owner we should really be looking out for, and we shouldn't ignore, or we shouldn't take for granted, is the issue of concentration risk. So concentration risk can happen in a number of areas. You would start with the issue of your offering, your product offering. You find that immediately all your sales are coming from, like immediately you start tipping over the 50% mark of all your sales coming from purely just one product or one service line,
Products. Yeah.
then that's a risk. So why do we call it a risk? We call it a risk because then it means if anything happened to if anything
That
happened
product
to
line.
that, and usually we worry about the downside risk. So risk by
Yeah.
definition is just that the objective that you are trying to achieve is not achieved. But here, the most important, the one which is catastrophic, is the downside risk. So if something adverse happens and something occupies over 50% of your revenue generation, for instance, then it means that's a risk. Because how do you recover? How do you cover 50% loss of business? So that's why that is considered as a risk. And for me, that's the thing. So when it comes to concentration risk, and we face this, and especially as a growing business, in the beginning, you are likely only to have one core offering that you are depending on. But you need to be very, and this is where measuring and keeping accounts and records is very important. Because when we started off as client focus then, and then now as more CFS, when we started off, we were so skilled to just one. In fact, we had over 80% of our revenue
Portfolio.
coming
Yeah. Coming
from
from
just
one product line,
one service line.
service line. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a big risk, because anything happens in that audit space, then we have it's existential, as they call it.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 And from the bank's point of view, when they are reviewing our financials, you are applying in terms of bankability, and they see that most of your revenue, especially when you are crossing over that 50%, 60%, 70%, and like us, like the way we were, 80% coming from one kind of offering,
One
then
service
you are
line.
considered a very high risk. Yeah. So that impacts on your bankability. So what did we do? We recognized the issue, and we didn't do it overnight. Of course, we just didn't immediately, but then we put in a plan in place and said, we want to make sure that, in 3 years' time, in 5 years' time, we have diluted this to below 40%. And by the grace of God, that's exactly where effectively are. Something that was 80% plus, in some months even 90% plus of our revenue, we dropped it down. So you need to be conscious of that risk. You need to understand how is your product mix, and how do those ratios sit, because that is going to impact your issue of bankability. The next one under concentration risk is the issue of a customer risk.
Yeah.
Where you only have one customer, or a significant part of your business is with one customer. Say, for instance, in the mining sector, you are only supplying one mine, FDM
Yeah.
or Pani or KCM. That is a big risk, because should that relationship change, I've got
End.
a,
Yeah. Yeah. Or let's say it
you know,
ends.
yeah, it's like, and these relationships change because the people on the other side are just people who make decisions on these procurement decisions. So you find over time, maybe they change, or they change their preferences and they move to somebody else. Then that is a problem. So even financiers, they actually want to say, look, when we are profiling, when we are doing bankability preparation, we would look at say, how do you sit in terms of how much are you getting related to a particular customer? Are you exposed? If you are, then of course, then you have to make plans to manage it, so that you can spread your risk. And the beauty with life, and this is the beauty with risk, is that once you identify it and you put plans in place, you find that you actually find solutions, because now it goes with the effort and how you change that. I had a very bad experience with one of my colleagues, and the client, who even ended up actually selling their business. So they had a contract. So initially he was mostly in mass market. So he was selling to, like everyday sales. And then ShopRite, of course, came in, and he had very good relationships there. And they had a seriously, a very, very worthwhile relationship with them. And they trusted him, and they gave him quite a lot of shelf space within ShopRite. Yeah. So orders were coming, and it moved from where, like it was almost like they were a small proportion, but ShopRite ended up being close to 70, 80%. And on the basis of that deal, he even went and borrowed to invest. Of course, like when you go to ShopRite, when you start dealing with people like ShopRite, they also even give you standards. They tell you, no, this is the kind of manufacturing space and infrastructure that you should have.
Yeah.
So he went and even borrowed on the back of this. But for me, when we did the analysis, to him, I said, you are too exposed. You are too exposed, because should anything happen to ShopRite, then you are unlikely to meet your obligations. and he had, all sorts of facilities, ODs, whatever. So when the relationship was strong, everything was fine because it was. But immediately they decided, they changed the key management, and the key management decided to go a different route on most of the products in terms of sourcing. There's competition out there.
Yeah.
So he lost that contract. And we're talking about 80%, 70 to 80% of the revenue gone. And then you've got debt obligations, so he just ended up selling the business so that then he can pay off all the loans. And so it was a very distressful scenario that I've been able to experience. So customer concentration, you need to, again, it's the issue of records. You need the records
Yeah.
to, you review the records, like we do, like, when we support through our fractional CFO. The issue is that's
Yeah.
one of the data points that we give on a monthly
In the
basis,
commentary.
so
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
can
When
see,
you're doing it.
yes, so that you can
Yeah.
see, is this within limits or it's outside? So therefore we need to do something about it, because the people who win with risk management are those who deal not when the
With
risk
the,
has crystallized, but when
when,
before, you start doing something to manage it before it gets into a catastrophe. And the same can be pointed. Yeah, you can go ahead.
I'll flip the coin, CD, and talking about this is one customer. You are supplying
Yes,
to one customer. Let's flip the coin and look at the source of your product. You are supplying this customer, but you're also buying from one source. Is that as big a risk as well? I want to believe it is. Just your thoughts about.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
equally just as bad. So if you are sourcing from one supplier, and you don't even have alternative supply, immediately something happens. Sometimes it's not because a relationship has soured. Maybe it's just that that supplier has gotten into an issue, right? And they are not able to supply you. Then it means you also equally can't supply your customer. So for me, it's equal weight. Customer concentration, supplier concentration, they equally fall onto the same issue. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's look at, before you get into the other aspects of risk, let me throw one thing to you. I mean, there are some entities, many of them, that have a lean structure. There is just the owner and maybe one person supporting. How big a risk is that, the way the business is structured? Is that something that you want to discuss and advise businesses to have some kind of support, some kind of stuff that they can ensure the entity goes beyond one particular individual, just in case the individual is run over by a car? God
Absolutely.
forbid. I mean, yeah.
Yes, and that is what they call key-man risk. And
Okay.
usually, for most growing businesses, it's the entrepreneur, because as you are growing the business, you're doing everything, right? You are finding the customers, you are delivering to the customers, you are doing the collections from the customers, and things like that. The business can't operate without you. That is what is called key man risk. Or there's a particular person you are so dependent on that, without them, then the business can't work. Then it's called key man risk. Again, that's the one that needs to be managed. And the best way to manage it actually is by creating, instead of relying on people to deliver, build a system. So rely on systems to deliver on these things rather than on people, because people can leave. An employee who you even maybe found on the street, they never had anything to do. You employ them, you train them, you pour yourself into them. Then when they know how to do the job, they decide to leave. You can't do anything. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and even you as the employee, I mean, as the entrepreneur, you need to
Yeah.
make sure that as you go on, you wean yourself, you wean yourself from the business so that the business is able to run without you. So that's why one of the best books I've ever, I always love and always go back to is the E-Myth. Okay, the E-Myth book, which talks about the issue of creating systems. And sometimes it sounds very complicated when we say creating systems, but it's pretty much just, and now with so many facilities, it's pretty much you just documenting how you do something because you know how to probably deliver to a client. So how the best way now is just dictate it. Step one, I do this. Step
Yeah.
two, I do this. Step three, I do this. Step four, I do this. Record it or record it into a video or something. Then that becomes what we call a standard operating procedure, which you can now give somebody who is, who the only thing they need to do is to follow the instruction. And if they can't follow instructions, then they are not good enough. So you can hive a lot of these things to other people so that other people, like you said, even when you are pursuing a lean structure, yeah, you need to be cognizant that you need continuity in most of these, and having standard operating procedures is very critical. And again, this is one space where we assist. We assist so that we can have very practical ways in which you can translate the procedures to everybody else that is helping you so that they can buy back your time. Then you can concentrate on the big issues, on finding clients, getting business, on developing your relationship with the banks, so that you are not, you sell, you deliver, that's when you go and sell again, you can't scale. You can't scale. So you need that. You need to build a team around, but empower that team with systems for them to do, and invest in systems that that would help. Our collaborators, is it Probes? They've come up with a fantastic ERP, which is quite affordable,
Yeah.
I must say, that would help in
Yeah.
managing all of these issues. So the beauty with an ERP is at least you have all the information in one place and you can get all your reports and things like that, including dashboards.
Excellent. Uh, the aspect of the when you are operating a business and you borrow, the tenure of that facility is, in my view, another risk that the business exposes itself to. Just, how does that impact the business and why should this be classified as a risk?
Yeah, so it's very critical. I'm glad you've brought that one up.
Yeah.
So the length of your contract sometimes
Yeah.
or your relationship can
Yes.
impact your risk profile. Yeah. So if you have, the longer the term, then the better.
Yeah.
So what happened was, like, for instance, Mopani. When Mopani was going through some hard times, for all its subcontractors, they moved to annual contracts where they would only give a contract for 1 year and then they would renew that contract. So nothing is guaranteed after 1 year.
Yeah.
That brought serious problems for most of the facilities, for the subcontractors to Mopani, because
Yeah.
most of the facilities could then only be, so if you want to go and speak to the bank and say, look, I need this, I need a facility for 2 years, for instance, they couldn't give it. They couldn't give it because
Yeah.
they are going to manage the risk. So they're assessing your risk based on what is probable, which is the length of your contract. So we had most of these facilities dropping down to to annual and things like that, which was a big problem, again, which feeds from the issue of the concentration risk. So for those subcontractors where they just had Mopani at the time, and Mopani was going through a hard time, they equally ended up having to go into a hard time, because those annual renewals they increase the risk to a particular, especially if that is your biggest source of your revenue, then your risk profile just shoots off the roof. Yeah. So there's need to manage that aspect as well, and say, look, here, how should we, when negotiating, especially on where there's some, it's a big value contract, the best usually is to negotiate a much longer. So the longer the contract, then the longer the term that the bank would equally give.
Excellent. And apart this, well said, well put, CD. What other risks should a business be looking out for apart from these? Are there any other risks that
yes. No, there are so many of them. I'm just gonna pick out the ones that we, under the fractional CFO side, we focus on, because we see them as more or less like existential. One of them is the issue of the profitability risk. Okay. So profitability is very important, because profitability is what determines whether you will survive tomorrow. Yeah. And it also, from the bank's point of view, it's also what shows them whether you can afford their their facility, the repayments as you go. Because with profitability, you're then able to invest in assets, which is something that they rely on as well. So it's very important to analyze the portfolio. So I talked of where we have different product lines. For us, it's service lines. But for each of those service lines, you now need to see, you need to allocate all the direct costs, so that you can see how profitable is the product. So it might be a big ticket thing, but if you are losing money on it, or the margins are too thin, then probably that's not something you want to be doing. Yeah, you need to concentrate on the other ones. So for me, doing unprofitable business is a sure way. In fact, in one of the books that I read about success in business, even before borrowing, make sure you are profitable. Yeah, make sure you are profitable before you go and borrow. Because if you bring a thin margin, if you bring debt in a thin margin business, it's a sure way to be a slave to the lender, because now all the value will just be taken up and paid to deal with those facilities. So for me, that's very critical. So the risk there for us is, how big is your margin? How big is your margin, your profitability? Then of course we also look at it from the operating expenses. You need to look at the risk you are sitting in there, and especially the seemingly small expenses, office expenses, this and this, petty cash, especially. Find out what that, and management accounts are the best way to show you the source of this, because they build up. I attended a cost management system program, which was very insightful. So we get into, and it was actually a lecture. We get into a lecture, and at the front there was a full sack of sand, and at the bottom they had just put, some bucket where the sand was dripping. And it was just dripping slowly.
Yeah.
They had put holes in the sack.
Yeah.
By the time we finished the 1 hour, 30 minutes, which was 90 minutes lecture, that whole sack, which was there, was actually at quarter. Then they even said, this is what happens when you don't manage the small expenses in your business. Don't assume that, these are just small, they are just
In
cashes.
total, they are very
No,
significant.
those are the ones that actually, impact. The bigger ones, you are always, so
On the
review these
lookout.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah. They become bigger issue over time. They actually become a big issue and a
Yes.
big risk. Yeah. And then the other one that we always want to focus on is the issue of the cash flow risk. Okay. You want to make sure that the business, how you are managing your working capital is very important. Bill quickly, collect quickly. Yeah. And if you can negotiate supplier terms, please, supplier terms, go and negotiate. And these are some of the things where if the operation is given to the delivery and operations are now being done by the team, this is where now you can build those relationships. Because even with suppliers, you can't just sit in your office and only just be sending them orders. You need to be going there and seeing them and negotiating terms with them. And the more you manage that working capital. So the way working capital works is, so what we call the working capital investment, it's your inventory plus your debtors minus your creditors. So you can see minus your creditors. So that minus is very important. So if you manage your turnover of the inventory, meaning inventory is quickly becoming sales, that's good. Then if you manage your collection, meaning your debtors are quickly becoming cash, and then you negotiate a much favorable, preferably longer than your receivable, then it means you have a bigger minus, then you are okay. So cash flow risk is very, very important. So if you don't manage any one of these properly, then you find that there are risks which develop. If your inventory is not okay, your debtors, then you find, you don't even have your creditors managed, then you find that now becomes a big problem, a big cash flow out. So when we're doing all of this, we even do, from operating cash, how much are you getting from as operating cash flow before the other things, and then we compare with your debt. So those are some of the things that you need to have. And last for me in terms of responses to this is, please, 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 they say pay yourself first. And on a personal level as well as in business, don't always spend all the money that you receive. Build some emergency reserve fund, because life, as it happens, is full of, in fact, life is just full of emergencies.
Surprising. It's not a straight line.
Yes.
Exactly.
We can never plan it. Yeah. It will always bring something out. So have that emergency fund, build it over time, but it's just the discipline of having a percentage kept. This is not money that you use for any, no, it's for that rainy day. Have a target and start building something and putting something in there from, especially, first of all, make sure you're profitable. Once you're profitable, one of the assets you should be, in fact, one of the assets you should be building is that emergency fund, because you will need it at some point. And from the bank's point of view, if you can build it to a level where you can meet 1 or 2, 3 installments, then there's no pressure for you. Yeah. So things can happen, but you still meet your obligations. and that reduces the risk. So those are the other ones that I would say. I'm sure there are so many other risks.
So many of them, yeah.
Concentrate on these as being the key ones that we see. They are quite existential, and they would very quite easily impact your bankability.
Great stuff. Great stuff.
Yeah.
Now, as we bring this to a closer, CD, you've identified the risks. For most of them, if not all of them, you've also provided some mitigation. There is something that you said that is very critical, that don't identify the risk when it's actually happening. It may be too late for you to do anything. Just a word of advice to the business out there. The first process being identify the risks that affect your business. Second is obviously mitigation. And just in summary, as we bring this to a close, how is the process of risk management in a typical business?
Yeah. So for me, it's about numbers. And this is where, even as an entrepreneur, you need to have a dashboard. You need to have a dashboard that gives you. So again, then it goes to the record keeping, because it has to be data driven. So, and this is something that we do under the fractional CFO kind of things, where we assist you build this system, including the dashboards, and of course, helping in the production. So you might even have an accountant or things like that, but they need help, and we can give them CFO level kind of a support. So for me, it's about visibility. So these risks that we've mentioned here, they need to be on a dashboard where you can see. You can see.
Keep an eye on them. Yeah.
Yeah, you can keep an eye on. For me, that's the only thing, because immediately you can have the information, then you can take action.
Yeah, exactly.
But but what happens with most of the growing businesses is they are flying blind. So they can't even see it coming. They can't see
GPS,
that the data are a problem. They can't see that inventory is becoming a problem. Yeah. They probably don't even have time to go and speak to suppliers and say, look, this one, we've been doing business with this person for a long time. Look at how much we've been able to buy from them. There's what we call a bot analysis. So every year, and in fact, even on a continuous basis, per supplier, you analyze how much business you gave them, because that is a leverage. You can now go to them and say, look, Buana, look how much business I gave you. Please give me some good terms.
Better terms, or give me a discount.
Either give me a price one, or
Reduction.
Extend some terms for me.
Terms,
because if they can extend, that's it's better than a loan. Better than a loan. It reduces. So for short-term financing, it's the best you can ever have.
Yes.
Other people's money. But if you don't have the data, how do you talk to them? How do you even identify which one is your strategic? Yeah. So other than just identifying, this is my biggest supplier, therefore I need to whatever, you can also leverage on that. Even as you are diversifying, you can leverage on that. You can even use that to go to other suppliers and say, look, this is how much I'm giving your friend there. Give me a good deal, and I'll give you half of this.
Excellent.
Yeah? Give me good terms.
Excellent. CD, with that reservoir of knowledge, we can now reserve that knowledge for the next podcast. I know we can go on and on. We never operate on a full tank. It's always full tank when it comes to sharing information on financial matters.
Yes.
We obviously have to end it here. And I want to thank you so much, CD, as usual, for coming through to share your expert analysis on these financial matters. Thank you, CD.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. So humbled that we're able to do this, and forever so grateful to you, RK, and the team for putting this together so that then we can share in our journey. We're very passionate about this because We want to see entrepreneurs succeed. Yeah, and that's what we're there for. That it really sits quite close to our hearts. Peace
Thank
and
you, CD.
out.
Cheers.
Over
And
that.
until next time,
Thanks.
it's goodbye for
All
now.
right.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Cheers.